Well, good morning.
Good morning.
That seemed to do it just fine for me. I also want to add my thanks and my welcome to all of you. I think this is a really, really important investment of your time. We can't thank you enough for being here. Inclusion and diversity is what's going to make us continue to be competitive in the marketplace. It will allow us to be able to connect with our customers in a way that our competitors can't. We've said before that inclusion and diversity is good business, and I've now come to realize that inclusion and diversity is great business. It allows us to innovate, do things like Roxo, which you've seen if you're here on campus roaming around Plano. It allows us to rise up to challenges, like the sudden loss of our parcel management systems and software. Watching our team around the table bring their perspectives to bear to solve that in the moment, that's the power of multiple stories. That's the power of inclusion and diversity. And then as we deal with natural disasters, whether it's the fires in California or the latest round of storms that came through the Gulf, we are able to together rise up and meet the challenge. And again, our stories continue to grow, but at the same time, the stories that we already have make us much more powerful together.
My professional career, I was spent about 29 years in corporate America, 25 of those with Procter & Gamble. And very interesting journey, but a fruitful one that I learned a lot on along the way. Spent 25 years there in business development is where I started, going down the street, peddling to doctors and dentists, and then moved into technical training. From technical training, I moved into HR, where I was a full-scale HR business partner for our global healthcare organization. And somewhere in that mix, I got started with diversity and inclusion, which we called it at that time. And from my HR business partner role, where I worked with our global healthcare organization to set their diversity and inclusion strategy, I then led the global D&I operations for P&G for 5 years. So that's, I think, where Leslie first saw me. And then I did some work with diversity best practices. And now I'm here with Jennifer Brown Consulting. So that's kind of how I got where I am. We want to look at, during this time together today, we've framed it around 3 essential questions or 3 essential topics. We want to look at what is inclusion and diversity. And we'll talk about that because that's very important as an organization. If you're going to have a strategic direction that makes sense, if you're going to have a communication, a message, or a branding of inclusion and diversity, the definition of it has to be clear. So we're going to talk a little bit today about how we at Jennifer Brown Consulting, how we define it, and some of the terms around that may be familiar to you. You may have heard them before. We're also then going to look at this notion around what are you supposed to do about it? So we'll examine what's your role, because everybody has a role. And we'll talk about that in terms of your role in this inclusion and diversity journey. And then we want to spend some time today beginning to get you to think about really what I call the notion of accountability, right? How do I know if I'm doing a good job, or what is a good job around inclusion and diversity? Because again, this journey that you're on, and it was mentioned, as Brian mentioned, it is what I call the enabler or the springboard to greatness. It is and can be the competitive advantage, but you got to have some accountability around it. So we'll talk about that as well. Okay. Now, some objectives, or what do we want to really dig into a little bit deeper? Talked about the definitions, but we also want to look at what I call the head and heart case around diversity and inclusion, or inclusion and diversity. Because for some people, they got into this work because they were passionate about it. They just really believed in it, and they will say it's fundamentally the right thing to do. And so their heart is in it. They are very emotive, if you will, about inclusion and diversity. There's others, and I happen to kind of be perusing a booklet back there that has what people call the business case, or what they call, and I'm not calling anybody crazy, but the head case, right? The head case, what are the numbers? What are the reasons that we do it? And so there's a lot of information, facts, business rationale. And so for some people, for them, it is all cognitive. right? Around we do it because it's good business, it's great business. Some people feel it's the right thing to do. They're passionate about it. And as we've been in this journey, what I've learned is that you need a little bit of both. And if you're going to be inclusion and diversity professionals or experts, when you're talking to someone who is a head person, right? Not a head case, but a head person, you have to know how to talk about it from a cognitive perspective. If a person is very passionate about it and they are emotive, either based on experience or based on the passion of it's the right thing to do, then you have to know how to reach them from an emotive standpoint. And I think as we've been in this journey, one of the things that we've learned, there's a little bit of dissonance when a person is emotive and they're trying to relate to a person who's cognitive, or vice versa. There's a person who's cognitive about inclusion and diversity relating to someone who's emotive, but you need a little bit of both, okay? And then we're going to talk about some tools for you individually as well as organizationally. We'll give you a little bit of some tools in this session, and of course, we'll do more as we go later in the day, all right? Our workshop norms or our session norms, really lean into today. I have no doubt that you're going to do that. I watched you as you came in this morning. There was so much energy in the room today, just as you greeted each other. So I really think you're going to be present and engaged. Lean in. As you listen today, this session, today, tomorrow, you may hear some confidential or very personal components that people will share. Just one of our asks or workshop norms is if you hear something that's a personal detail, let that person own their own personal details. Let's keep that confidential. But what we learned from today, can we make an agreement that we'll share what we learned?
Sure.
Yes.
All right, there we go. All right. The other thing about today, over the next 2 days, one of the things that I've learned in this journey is sometimes the topic of inclusion and diversity, shake your head if you agree, can be uncomfortable.
Very much so.
All right, I heard the phrase, very much so, right? It can be uncomfortable, maybe because it could be about a topic that's very sensitive. It could be an experience that takes you to a place that may be painful. It could be lack of knowledge about a particular group or identity or demographic. But I encourage you today and tomorrow to lean in to those places that may be uncomfortable for you. The reason for that is that there is an opportunity to learn something new. But this area, this topic sometimes can be a little bit uncomfortable. But as you lead this work for Fedex office, you may want to or may have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. All right? And let's learn and grow together. All right? So are we ready?
Yes.
Okay. How is it defined? How do we define diversity and inclusion? We say diversity is the mix and inclusion is making the mix work, right? Diversity is the mix and inclusion is making the mix work. So let me ask you a question. Can you have diversity without inclusion?
Yes.
Okay, you guys say yes, right? You can have diversity without inclusion, meaning you can have diverse people in the room, both externally or visibly diverse, or you could have a group that looks to be what we might call non-diverse, but because they're individuals, they still would be diverse. But you can have diversity but not have inclusion. Let me flip the question. Can you have inclusion and not have diversity? You say yes? Okay, absolutely you can. You can have inclusion, which means you have a group where they work together. There is a strong culture, but it is pretty much a unilateral group, either in terms of their visual look or their thought pattern or their behavior pattern. So yes, you can have inclusion and not have diversity. Diversity is what we call the what or the who. It's all of what makes us who we are. It's all of what makes you who you are. All of us, right, have elements of diversity. I talked about even in my story of where I was born, where I was raised, where I worked, the jobs functions that I had, what I'm doing now. All of that makes me what or who I am. So diversity is the mix, but inclusion really is what I call the skill of making the mix work, right? Inclusion is a skill which can be learned, which can be practiced, and which should be repeated. And so that's why you're here today. And I'm glad that you all say inclusion and diversity, because inclusion really is the skill that makes diversity work. All right. We like to say inclusion is the how. All right, repeat after me. Diversity is the what? Okay, inclusion is the how. Diversity is what? Inclusion is how do you take advantage? How do you leverage? How do you maximize the diverse perspectives that you have, right? I like this other quote. Diversity is counting the heads, right? If you've been in this for a while, some people are even averse to diversity because they feel like all diversity is about is counting people. Would you agree? Right? It's counting the heads, but inclusion is making what's inside the heads count. Again, diversity to what? Inclusion is the how. Another question for you. How many of you like a good party? Let me try that again. Nobody over here said anything. Let's try that. How many of you like a good party? Right? Okay. So diversity is being invited to the party. This is a quote by Verna Myers. Inclusion is being asked to dance. How many of you have ever been to a good party and there's some people on the dance floor and there are other people who never get off the ball, right? You ever been to, even if you go to the club, or if you go to a bar where they have music and some people are out on the floor and they're just dancing and having a good time and there are other people just looking like I'm not even in the same environment, right? So when we think about that from a work perspective, just because a person is here collecting a check, by the way, right? It doesn't mean that they feel as if they are engaged. So inclusion, again, is the intentional portion or the intentionality that comes with getting that diverse mix that you have, get them engaged. Here's another piece that when we talk about equity and inclusion, because the other thing that you'll hear and see a lot today is this notion not just of D&I or I&D, inclusion and diversity, but the introduction of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, what I want you to pay attention to on this slide are the three circles on each side that represent the heads. You see that? Okay. Now, if you look at the heads that are on your left, as you look at the screen, you can see that they are all standing on a box or a square that's of equal length, correct? All right. But what do you notice about one of the heads? What'd you say? It's still below the line. And if the head is below the line, that means what? They can't see, right? If they were looking at something, you would notice that there are two of the people that can see. There's one head that's below the line, but they're all standing on equal parts, right? But if you look on the right side, what do you notice? All three heads can what? See, they're all above the box, or they're all able to see. But you also notice that they're not on equal boxes. And so when we think about equity, this says equity really is about what does it take to make everyone successful? What does it take to make everyone successful versus giving everybody equal treatment? So let me tell you how this might play out in a work setting, right? The task here at Fedex office is to give everyone here whatever they need to be successful, no matter what their role is, right? Everybody can't be the CEO. Everybody can't be the head of diversity, inclusion, and diversity. Everybody can't be the vice president of this or the president of that, but everybody can do something, correct? Everybody that's getting paid to do a role at Fedex office, what are you expecting them to do? Say it. You expect them to do their job, right? So equity says we want to give every individual at Fedex office what they need to be successful. And so that's really the task of equity. Another way this plays out is when we talk about inclusion, I've been with clients who talk about the fact that, well, everybody can't be at every meeting. You're right, right? Inclusion doesn't mean everybody has to come to every meeting or everybody has to weigh in on every decision. That's not an efficient way to do work. Would you agree? Right? Not an efficient way to do work. But equity says I'm still going to give every person at every level what they need to be successful. That's what equity is. And that's the difference between equity and equal treatment. Because even with equal treatment, in essence, somebody is what? Still left out. Correct? Okay, so when we think about this notion of inclusion and diversity and what it means, I want you to really take notice of this and think about what do we need to do to give every person, regardless of their story, regardless of how they got here, regardless of where they work, how do we give every individual what they need to be successful? And that's what equity is. And that's the difference between equality versus equity. All right? Okay. So we want to look at the second question, or the second element that we have in this deck. So what are you supposed to do about it? Or how do we begin to think about, now that I understand I have a responsibility, if you will, or I have a role that I can play in making sure that everyone is successful. And let me just say this, if you are a leader of people, if you have a team of 2 or a team of 20, right, there's a role that you can play to have everyone on your team to be successful. If you are an individual contributor, you do not have people that report to you. Again, there's a role to help people be successful. So it leads very well into this notion of what do I do now, right, that I understand the definition of diversity. And we want to start by having you think about, well, what if I do nothing? And I like to think about this as there are some people who are what I call, and I hope I can get these definitions right, I call them actively passive, which means that they have consciously decided I'm not going to do anything. Right? Anybody know people like that? Maybe not around inclusion and diversity, but around any topic, right? Actively passive, where there's a conscious decision, hey, that's not my job, right? I don't do that. That's for someone else to worry about. So they've made a conscious decision to do nothing, okay? They can be actively passive, or a person can be what I call passively active, if that can, and these are Jeffrey's definitions, so roll with me, okay? Passively active says, I know something should be done, but I'm just kind of going to sit back and wait for somebody else to do it. So it's almost as if you hear something or you see something, but you, as they say in the airport, if you see something, say something, right? And so sometimes we hear something or we see something, but we don't say anything. And so that silence is just like not doing anything, okay? So I just wanted you to think about that when we talk about this notion of not doing anything. It could be a conscious decision, but I would venture to say that many people are in that other category, right? Where they see something or they hear something, but they say nothing. Would you agree? All right. But let's see what happens when you do that. When you do that, the impact in the organization is this topic or this concept that we call covering. Now, this term or this topic of covering was actually developed by a sociologist by the name of Irving Goffman. I don't know that he specifically called it covering, but as a sociologist, he talked about how humans behave, how they interact with each other, what happens in human interaction. And so he did a lot of work in this area, was a university professor for many, many years. But this is where this term covering comes from. And we define it, or what it means is when you downplay or disassociate yourself from what is perceived as a stigma about a part of your identity, all right? So it is perceived as a stigma, it's a part of your identity, you downplay or disassociate yourself from that. I'll give you some more info. So it can happen from an age perspective, right? So let me use myself as an example, maybe a little bit comical. The reason that I have no hair, right? I say I now have no hair by choice. But the reason I made a choice is because it was happening by force. Right? There were certain things that were happening that made it look like, from an age perspective, he's older than he looks. Michael Jordan, same way, right? Michael Jordan started balding before he was 30 years old. So he popularized this look. Thank you, Mr. Jordan. But again, that's one of the ways there might be a stigma associated with age. So we do things, quote unquote, to cover. From a race perspective, we'll talk a little bit more about how that plays out, how people might do things to disassociate themselves with a perceived stigma around race. For a lot of African Americans, it's around one of the things that people do is this notion of hair, right? Especially in the African American community, because there are so many ways that people wear hair, right? From dreads to bald to high top fades to all of these. And so even in my own career, I can remember when we started having young men come to Procter and Gamble who were wearing dreads, and it was like, oh, is he professional? Is he what, can he do the job? And so that notion of what does that say to others about capability? So some would say, I'll just look like everybody else, so there's no perception that I can't do the job. So that's what we mean sometimes by covering by race. Same thing by gender. Real quick story. Started at P&G in 1987. In one of our first sales trainings, I found a picture years later of a sales training. And back when I started, some of you probably remember, okay, that it was very much suit and tie. It was either a gray suit, a black suit, or a blue suit, navy blue with a white shirt and some type of, understated tie. That was what the men were supposed to wear. I happened to pull out a picture, and there were women in the class. But when I looked at the picture, all the women were dressed like men. But they had on skirt suits that were gray, that were black, that were navy blue, with a white blouse and a scarf that tied that looked like a bow tie. Anybody remember those days, right? So that's an example of covering by gender. I got to dress like the group because I don't want to be perceived as someone that can't function within the group. That's a way that covering plays out. Same thing with religion and sexual orientation. An individual might not talk about their partner, right? Or their husband or their wife if it's a same-sex relationship, same-gender relationship. They may cover that, again, because of the perception of their ability to engage, their ability to be productive, all right? Now, there are 4 what we call areas along this notion of covering. And I've just given you some of the examples, right? Around appearance, people may cover around appearance. What do we feel we can show? And the key connection to this covering concept is that I cover because I do not want to be perceived with this stigma that might cause me to be perceived as less than in terms of capability, right? So what do we feel we can show around appearance? Affiliation, the behaviors that we are willing to display. One of the examples that comes to mind here is sometimes individuals who may be of Muslim faith may disassociate themselves or may not let you know they're going through Ramadan, right? Or that they're fasting, so they don't want to be associated with that, or their prayer schedule, right? So they may downplay or disassociate themselves with some of the behaviors that are a part of their culture. Advocacy is another way that we see covering. And what we mean by that is people who are of a particular identity sometimes do not advocate for other people, right? So for example, if there's a woman who is successful in the organization, she may not be a strong advocate for other women because she doesn't want to be perceived as, well, you only advocate for women. What about other people? I see some head nods in the room, right? So a person may cover by, I can't advocate for people who are part of my identity because I don't want to be seen as that, that rabble rouser, that, that radical person when it comes to this topic or this area. So what they do is they cover. And sometimes they don't advocate for people in their own identity. Association. Anybody in the room, let me see by show of hands, is anybody based on your identity, race, gender, orientation, have you ever known yourself to be the only in a particular room or particular group? Okay, see a lot of hands go up, right? So if you are the only and you see one other person come in the room that's like you, what do you typically want to do? You want to go, you right? What's up? How you doing? Right? You want to gravitate to them, right? But sometimes when you cover, when you see them, you might say, that's okay. I see some of you laughing, right? Why are you chuckling? Because you don't want to be over there associated with them because of, say it, they think we're planning or they think we're doing something, right? So sometimes some people will not associate with the other only, or if they are a smaller number in the room, right? They will not associate with the other folks of their identity. So they downplay it or they cover. All right. Now, from a statistical perspective, this is so interesting. Here's what we found is that across the identities, it says that 83% of people who identify as LGBTQ have covered at some point in their career, in their work life. 79% of African Americans have covered. 67% women of color have covered. 66% of women. 63% of Latino or Latina have covered. But here's the very interesting thing. 45% of straight white men have covered as well. Wow. So what this suggests is that somewhere along the line, everyone has covered. Now, of course, the numbers are more stark as you look at the other demographic areas around diversity or the other identity areas around diversity and inclusion, which, again, from a practice and profession perspective, that's not out of character, right? So there are two takeaways from this. One, everyone has done it in some way, either by appearance, association, affiliation, or advocacy. But if you look at when you layer on the different areas of the demographics, there is more covering going on as you layer on the areas of demographics. So now I want you to think about this. If a person is showing up at Fedex office and they are covering as they are working, tell me what they are not doing. What did you say? They are not working, right? They're spending time trying to figure out, how do I navigate here, right? Versus figuring out what I'm doing. So go back to equity versus inclusion. When we talk about doing or giving everyone what they need to be successful, one of the elements of giving people what they need to be successful, regardless of their level in the organization, is to be able to give them the freedom to not have to cover, right? Let me just, if anybody is brave enough this morning, all right? Now, you may not be talking about yourself, but maybe you know someone. Anybody know someone? So I'll just ask it that way. Do you know someone at FedEx office who you think has covered? Let me see your hands. Okay. See, some of you thought I was asking about you. I didn't say, were you the one covering? So do you know someone who you think has covered? A few hands went up. So even with the few hands that went up, I want you to think about equity versus equality, right? When we think about equality, we might say, well, they all have a job. They all have a role description. They all know what they're supposed to do. Why aren't they doing it? Equity says, have we given them the freedom to not have to cover, right? And the other thing about covering is if you think about the way Irving Goffman kind of phrased this, it's one of those things that just happens in human interaction. A person's not going to come up to you and say, hey, man, I'm covering today. They're not going to say that, right? But what happens is what we do is we process it from an objective work perspective. This person isn't meeting expectations. It might be here. They're not a good fit. Anybody ever heard that? Right? And then we say, well, what does that mean? Well, they just don't fit, right? So we rationalize it sometimes in objective ways, but there may be something subjective going on with that person. If they're spending more time covering, it takes away from their ability to be productive. Still with me? Yes. All right. Okay. So these are just some examples that kind of I talked about the hair, affiliation, again, talking about different events going on in the current news stream, for example, not advocating for folks of your identity, and then not associating with people from your identity as well. So those are just some quotes that people might say, or those are things that people might think when it comes to covering. All right. So what if I want to do something? Now that I understand if I am either passively active or actively passive, and I'm not doing anything, either by choice or I'm just, choosing not to be active, or I don't want to say anything even though I know I should. So what if I want to do something? How do I begin? Or what do I do? I want to begin by having you think about this continuum that shows us really the evolution from an exclusive culture to an inclusive culture. Starts off with people feeling disrespected, unwelcome, or disengaged. So can I give Fedex office some kudos this morning? So one of the things that I noticed today is that again, I being a visitor, I did feel very welcome. People were greeting me and saying hello, and I noticed how you all were greeting each other. So if that's what you do on a normal basis, you are off to a good start. So why don't you give yourselves a round of applause? But exclusion is this notion of feeling disrespected, feeling unwelcomed, and it leads to people feeling disengaged, right? Anybody ever been in a room where, even in a work setting, maybe not here, but somewhere where you're in a room and someone comes in and they acknowledge everybody in the room except you? I see a few hands go up, right? That's an indication of this exclusion, because that makes people feel unwelcome, disrespected, and then they end up disengaged. Moves from exclusion to what we call tolerance, which says, even though I'm here, I still feel like an outsider. So I may have skills. Some people may recognize those skills, but I still don't feel like I, quote unquote, fit in. All the way to acceptance. The big difference with acceptance is, while I understand my value, I feel like people are starting to understand my value, I have to promote myself, or I have to always remind others of the value of my experience, my capabilities, and my skills. When you move from acceptance to value, people are encouraged. I was glad to hear this morning the notion of coming together around challenges and hearing different perspectives and encouraging different perspectives. Because what that does is it helps you to be cautious around blind spots. And then ultimately the concept of inclusion. And you could actually kind of measure yourself or think about where you are along this scale. People regularly feeling welcomed, valued, respected, and heard. So this is where you start, right? You ultimately want to be in the inclusion area, but this is a way for you to think about, where am I personally in terms of how I experience Fedex office, and what would others say about how they are experiencing our work culture? Okay, so when we think about this notion of getting to this continuum of inclusion, there are two dynamics that play out. There are what we call insider groups and outsider groups. And every culture, right, has a dominant group and a subdominant, or what I call a dominant group or a subdominant group. And that is insiders and outsiders, right? Insiders typically are seen as normal. They fit in, but here is the key. They are seen as capable. And because they are seen as capable, those are the individuals that, if there's a high-profile project, they get approached with that project. If there's a great opportunity to go to another part of the organization, work in another division, expand their skills, they get approached. And many times they are seen as the go-to people, right? Because they are seen as capable, so they're always approached, they feel included. Show of hands, how many of you would say there are insiders or insider groups within Fedex office? All right, okay, all right. Show of hands says there are. There's also those who are this definition of outsiders. But the key here, the distinction I want you to see, is they are seen as deficient. So if they are seen as deficient, somebody tell me what happens, or what happens with those people that are seen as deficient? They're excluded, right? What else? They are bypassed, right? I don't know if we ought to give this to him, or I don't know if we ought to give this to her. I'm not sure if they can really handle this. That's how we rationalize it in the conversation, okay? So if they're seen as deficient, they're excluded, they're suspected. Again, by show of hands, how many of you think there are people who feel like they are in the outsider group at Fedex office? So how do we move people from being outsiders to insiders? This is one of our signature phrases that JBC uses. This is one of our signature concepts. You want people to feel welcomed, valued, respected, and heard. Heard doesn't mean you will always agree. But heard means you'll feel like I at least had an opportunity to be heard. Go back to give people what they need to be successful. Welcomed, valued, respected, heard. If you're anywhere around JBC, you'll hear this term. You'll see it more over the next couple of days as well. I know there's a lot of words here. This is an eye chart. But what I want you to focus on is those 5 areas to the left. That this notion of being welcomed, valued, respected, and heard, it involves all 5 of those elements of your work or 5 elements of an organization. For people to be successful, they have to have meaningful work. Would you agree? Right? No matter what it is, they have to understand how what I do, whether it's at in the field. I talked to someone this morning who was in transportation, someone in finance, someone in other parts of the organization. They have to know that what I do here has meaning. And though it gives you some ways to think about welcomed, valued, respected, and heard. Great managers do this. How many of you have heard this? People don't leave companies. Finish the statement. They leave managers or they leave bosses, right? So a great manager can make a difference, whether you have 2, 5, 10, or 20 in this notion of welcomed, valued, respected, and heard. An inclusive culture, which is what you're talking about, which is the journey that you are on. Welcomed, valued, respected, and heard. Again, bringing your whole self to work. There are growth opportunities. Again, everyone may not be able to matriculate up at the same pace, or it may not happen vertically, but what about horizontally? Can people expand their skills? Do they have growth opportunities? And this is a key one, trust in leadership. And in the session that I'm going to do with the advisory council on the stories and courageous conversations, we're actually going to break these down in much more detail. But I wanted everyone to see that across these 5 areas that impact your culture, that impact your workplace, I want you to begin to think about, are we a welcoming culture intentionally and consistently? Do people feel valued? Do they feel respected? And do they feel heard? And if they do on a regular basis, I guarantee you'll have an inclusive culture. That's one of the things that you can do about it. As you move people from being outsiders to insiders, here's another concept that has been around, I think, primarily started in the LGBTQ community, but it is a very powerful concept that is taking hold across the whole DEI space, inclusion, equity, and diversity. This notion of being an ally, right? So again, what can I do about it? I can be an ally. Each of you can be an ally. But let's talk about what that means. There is a continuum. Here's what we've seen as we think about this ally continuum. People can start off by being apathetic, which means they have no understanding of the issues. And I like to encourage people to ally for someone who is the most different from them. Someone tell me, why do you think that's important to ally for someone who's the most different from you? Yes. That starts the change. I saw another hand.
It helps you understand someone else's perspective. What helps you understand them and how to help them.
It helps you understand someone's perspective that's probably totally different from yours, right? You're talking about story. It helps you understand someone's story who might be totally different from yours and gives you an opportunity to maybe have some aha moments versus moments of judgment. I saw another hand. Yes, please.
Optics to it too. The person that you wouldn't think would be an ally, and someone sees those 2 people coming together, that it wakes up others.
Absolutely. There's some optics to it, right? That when you see someone, you might also almost be surprised that this person is allying for this person. Because you go, what do they have in common? Right? But it's because they've taken the time to understand. But if you are not understanding of the issues for that person, then we call that apathetic, which means you don't really understand what's going on within both head, cognitive, and heart, emotive. Aware says, I know some of the concepts, but I'm not active. So again, not doing anything about it. Passively active or actively passive. Then you move to being active. I'm informed about issues, but I am not proactive. I only get involved when prompted or asked. But this is what we want. We want advocates to go across this continuum where a person is committed, they are routinely and proactively championing inclusion. And that's why I a lot of times like to put the challenge out there to advocate or to be an ally for someone who's the most different from you. Because I think it's a very powerful learning journey. And if you get to the point where you have learned and you're now advocating proactively for those people, I go back to the optics comment. It actually can be an encouragement for others in the organization. So this helps move those who you feel are outsiders, moves them into being insiders. Okay? All right. Now, how do you know if you're doing a good job? All right? Burning questions? No burning questions? You guys are just taking it all in? All right. All right. How do you know if you're doing a good job? Well, a couple of ways we want to start this conversation today. And we're going to revisit it over the next couple of days. First of all, this slide says recognize your biases. And we've done a lot of work around this notion of unconscious bias. But I think that first sentence is so powerful, right? That everyone has unconscious bias, even good people. We have good people in the room today, right? Right? And remember, we started off by saying that get comfortable with the uncomfortable. And sometimes around this topic, some people lean back because I don't want anyone to feel like I'm not a good person, right? Or I don't want anyone to feel like I am judgmental. Or I leaned in once before and I got attacked as being judgmental, so I'm going to stay over here. Any of those relate to anybody's experience? I see a few head nods, right? So even good people have bias or are subject to bias. If you have it, it's just part of who we are. It's part of how our brains think. Doesn't make you a bad person. So everybody's a good person. Everybody's a good person. Look at your table. Look at your table. See, everybody's a good person, right? We're good people. But all of us are subject to blind spots. All of us are subject to bias. And then we may sometimes unconsciously behave on that. And even when we behave on it, it doesn't make us a bad person. And that's going to help us to go forward in the journey. We think about this as it's not, when we say not a fixed characteristic, in essence, what we're saying is understanding that I, as a good person, am subject to bias. I have to work on this every day. And I have to be honest with you, even as a person that's been doing inclusion and diversity now for about 30 years. So all of you who thought I was only 35, I'm older than 35. So I've been doing this for about 30 years, and I have had my own moments in my journey, in my story, where I was doing diversity and inclusion or inclusion and diversity, and I was still recognizing some of my own biases and how I had to continue to develop. So good people and people who have good intentions around inclusion and diversity can still be subject to bias, but we've got to work on it every day, right? We have to do something and continue to keep the fires stoked, continue to engage and lean in the journey. Just like this little a phrase here says, you don't just brush your teeth once a week, right? Something. Right? Somebody said in there, I know someone said, I hope not, right? But what we're saying is you work on this continually, right? And you can still be a good person and still learn. Examine your beliefs. We're not asking people to necessarily change their beliefs, but understand how your beliefs cause you to engage. Challenge your assumptions. And Dr. Meyer is going to talk a little bit more this I think in the next session with the group that she's with. She's going to go a little bit deeper into unconscious bias. But one of the things that happens is when we make our assumptions and we act quickly on those, because in order to process information, we just do it quickly. And so this is saying, examine your beliefs, challenge your assumptions, slow down a little bit, make sure you're getting the whole picture. So I'm almost to the end, but I want to give you now some ways to think about this organizationally. A lot of what I've given you are applied to you individually, but how do you begin to think about interrupting bias systemically in the organization? So I want to give you a few ways to think about it, okay? Around performance, look at some of the questions here, okay? Who do you encourage to speak out at meetings? Question for you. Anyone in the room ever been in a meeting and you gave what you thought was a brilliant idea? And the group said, And then someone else gave the same idea. And everybody said, man, that is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Wow, what a great idea. And you're sitting over there going, I just said that. Right? That ever happened to anybody? Right? So that kind of gets at who do you encourage to speak out at meetings? Whose voices do you value? Who gets the most airtime and participation at meetings? How can you systemically, right, intentionally engage or set up meetings so that different voices, new voices can be heard? Different levels in the organization can be heard. Who gets the most coaching, right? Who gets the most mentoring or sponsoring? Go back to the covering piece around advocacy, right? And I want to encourage you, and hopefully you will encourage the organization to allow people to advocate, even if they're advocating for their own identity, because sometimes if the person from the identity doesn't do it, it won't get done, right? So we got to give them the freedom to be able to do that. Who gets mentored? How is feedback delivered? Is it on a consistent basis? Is it? I'll add a piece. Is it both subjective and objective? Right. So when you see a person that someone says they're not a good fit, who steps back to say, well, what might be going on that we do not see that is the reason they are not a good fit, or that we're describing them as not a good fit? All right. Think about it from your customer base. How are customers considered? How do you interact with customers in the store? Think about it demographically. Is it a consistent basis in terms of how customers are engaged, welcomed, treated? Are customers welcomed, valued, respected, and heard? Right? So how do you interrupt bias around performance? How do you interrupt bias when it comes to your compensation systems? Okay? Are your compensation systems set up in a way that allows people to have what they need to be successful? All right, equity versus equal treatment. And I understand, I've been in HR, so I understand the things you got to work around in terms of compensation legalities, but hey, folks, it can be done, right? It can definitely be done. Who's recognized, who's visible, who's recognized by leaders? You know, I call these the people who do not have positional influence. They don't have influence by their title or by the scope of their work, but they have influence because they're like E.F. Hutton. When they step in a room, people listen, right? So who are those individuals? Who do the leaders go to? And are they only going to the same people? Have they expanded their go-to people? Again, how is it distributed? Again, interrupting bias from a compensation standpoint. Around talent assessment, all right, here's that famous phrase, right? When you say a candidate is not the right fit, what do you mean? So let me empower each of you. Can I do that, Leslie? A little. So I'm giving you a little bit of power to say, when you hear that person is not the right fit, now they may not be. They may not be. But you want to ask them, so tell me, what do you mean when you say they're not the right fit? You want to make sure that a good person is not acting off of a bias. You want to make sure that you've seen the whole picture, okay? All right, how do you identify candidates for promotion? And this last bullet, when you think about succession planning, one of the ways that we've worked with organizations, and when I was in HR, this was a big question for us. When we talk about matriculating people up through the organization, if your high potential list or your bench or the people within the succession planning pool, if that is not a diverse pool, you'll never have a diverse leadership, right? So this is one of the ways to think about how do you interrupt bias, to ask yourself, is our pool of candidates even diverse enough for us to be able to think about how do we want to engage our leadership going forward? Again, organizationally, how do you interrupt bias? From a talent development perspective, I'll just go with the first phrase, interrupt that many-me bias, right? In other words, you see someone and you say, man, that person is really smart. Man, man, they're really engaging. Then you find out, oh, they went to the same university that you went to. They have some of the same characteristics. And you say to yourself, they remind me of me. Right? So of course they're going to be great because they're just like me. Interrupt the mini-me bias, right? From a talent perspective. Look for people who may have differing experiences, okay? All right? Do you create opportunities for those who are not as extroverted? Sometimes the introverts get passed over because they're not naturally extroverted. The mini-me bias says you're looking for people just like you, all right? Again, a lot of words here. What I want you to think about is what's the business case driver? This goes back to what I said earlier about the head, right? I talked about the cognitive. So when people want to understand some of the cognitive case, think about what we just talked about in terms of how you interrupt bias in the workplace. But then this also begins to look at your practices, your policies, your procedures, and your people, right? Across the board. And then things around unconscious bias, your ERG progression. What do you call do you have ERGs here? You don't have ERGs? Some organizations that have them, but they look at how they evolve over time is another way. The inclusion continuum that we talked about. How do you sustain culture and behavior change in the workplace? So again, this gives you a structured, systemic way to think about how do you operationalize inclusion and diversity. Now, all of this may not apply to you, but it gives you, whether you want to look at the workforce, right? Your demographics and the people, that's the mix. Diversity is the mix. Whether you want to look at your workplace, that's the how. That's inclusion. What's going on in your workplace, or whether you want to look at your marketplace, how you are serving your customers and the people who are engaged and buy the services that you provide. You may want to do one of three. You may want to do all three. You may want to be strategic. But here's a way for you to think about how do you operationalize inclusion and diversity. It's not just the what, but here is a way to think about it as the how from an organizational level. And again, particularly for people who want it cognitively, right? They just don't want the emotional case. I want to understand this from a structure or cognitive standpoint. Here's a way that you can help them think about that. All right? I'm only 2 minutes over. All right? So I want to stop here. All right? Thank you for listening to me.